The call came at the worst possible time. In Montecito, the air was calm, the kind of California quiet people pay millions for. The house sat still under the sun. No cameras outside. No palace aides moving through long halls. No royal schedule pinned to a board. Just distance. Distance from London. Distance from duty. Distance from the life Prince Harry once knew better than his own reflection. Then the private line rang. Not a secretary. Not a courtier. Not one of those polished palace men who speak in soft tones and hard meanings. King Charles himself. And if the whispers are true, this was not a father checking in on his son. This was a monarch delivering a warning. Harry, according to people said to be familiar with the moment, did not expect the call to go that way. He may have expected tension. Maybe even anger. But not this. Not the tone. Not the message. And certainly not the threat hanging behind every word. Because this time, the issue was not another interview. Not another book. Not another documentary full of hurt feelings and old wounds. This time, the palace believed something much worse had happened. What the public had been shown as a polished wellness trip to Australia was, according to the rumor mill now spinning at full speed, something else entirely behind the scenes. Palace watchers began whispering that Meghan's visit may not have been just a brand-friendly overseas appearance. The claim was darker, sharper, and far more explosive. She was allegedly filming. Not simple home video clips. Not harmless travel memories. A high-end, behind-the-scenes docuseries. And according to those same reports, it was being done without the Crown's blessing. That is where this story stops being family drama and starts looking, at least through palace eyes, like a direct challenge. Because in royal circles, permission is everything. Optics are everything. Timing is everything. And if the palace really believed private meetings, official energy, and royal-adjacent access were being turned into content, then what looked glamorous from the outside may have felt unforgivable on the inside. That is what made the call so chilling. Today we are diving into the moment royal insiders say changed the mood completely between Prince Harry, Meghan, and Buckingham Palace. Not in the soft, vague way these stories are usually told. Not with the usual smiling photos hiding the knives. We're talking about the whispers of a real breaking point. The kind that leaves no room for cleanup. Because what many people don't know is that the monarchy can tolerate embarrassment. It can survive bad headlines. It can even outlast betrayal. But monetization? That is where the mood changes. And if one thing has haunted this family ever since Harry and Meghan stepped away from royal life, it is the fear that the crown itself could become a product. A backdrop. A logo. A feeling sold in pieces to the highest bidder. The reported issue in Australia struck right at the center of that fear. There were claims that the Sussex image, the royal glow still hanging around them, had been used to support premium wellness events with eye-watering prices. Some figures floating in the gossip press reached as high as $3,000 a ticket. That number alone was enough to make royal traditionalists choke on their tea. But the real sting, according to the chatter, was not the ticket price. It was the idea that private access, carefully guarded symbolism, and even interactions with officials may have been captured for later commercial use. If true, that would not just be awkward. It would be war. And Buckingham Palace, for all its silence, knows how to fight when it feels the institution is being cornered. The strange thing is, none of this landed out of nowhere. That is what makes it feel heavier. People close to royal reporting have been saying for years that the relationship between Harry and the palace has not really healed. It just kept changing shape. 1 month it looked cold. The next month it looked polite. Then a funeral happened, or a health scare, or a public appearance, and everyone wondered if the frost had melted. But below the surface, the trust never fully came back. Not after the interviews. Not after the streaming deals. Not after the memoir. And certainly not after the feeling in palace circles that every private conversation might one day return dressed up as content. So when word of this Australia project began to move through royal gossip networks, the reaction was not calm. It was immediate. People did not ask, "Is this unfortunate?" They asked, "How far has this gone?" That says everything. Because once the palace starts speaking in the language of lines crossed, there are only a few places left for the story to go. One of them is damage control. Another is exile. And then there is the option royal watchers have been whispering about in almost theatrical terms. The nuclear option. That phrase did not come from nowhere. It began surfacing in side conversations among royal commentators and those who claim to know how the institution thinks under pressure. The idea was simple, brutal, and symbolic all at once. If the footage were ever released as a commercial project, then King Charles might be prepared to act in a way that would leave no confusion. No more half in, half out. No more soft edges. No more benefit of the doubt. Just consequences. Titles placed into abeyance. Residences closed off. Remaining links cut cleanly. For Harry, if this version of events is even partly true, that would have been the part that hit hardest. Because for all the public anger, all the books, all the speeches, there has always been one emotional thread running under his story. He left the royal system, yes. But did he ever truly believe the final door would close? Maybe not. Maybe somewhere inside him there was still a son who thought family rules bend when family is involved. A son who believed the father would appear before the king. That blood would be protocol in the end. But there is a cruel lesson in royal history. The crown does not like competition. And it hates being used. So when that call came through to Montecito, it may not have sounded loud. The most frightening warnings rarely do. They arrive in measured tones. Controlled sentences. Careful phrasing. That is how royalty does damage. Not by shouting, but by making sure every word lands exactly where it is meant to. And Harry, according to the picture painted by this story, understood that. He was shaken because he finally heard something in his father's voice that no son wants to hear. Finality. But there's more to this story. Because the real drama was not only in what the palace believed Meghan had done. It was in what Harry was suddenly forced to choose between. To understand why this hit so hard, you have to go back. Not all the way to childhood. Not yet. Just far enough to remember that Harry did not leave the royal family in a clean, simple way. He left in pain, in anger, in exhaustion. And he left with Meghan beside him, both of them convinced, or at least presenting themselves as convinced, that they were escaping a machine that had failed them. That was the public story. And to many people, it made sense. There was sympathy at first. Real sympathy. The pressure of royal life is not hard to imagine. Cameras everywhere. Rules everywhere. Old traditions wrapped around human beings who are not built to live like museum pieces. Add race, tabloid obsession, family tension, and the sense of being unprotected, and suddenly their exit looked less like rebellion and more like survival. That is why the early chapter mattered so much. They were not just leaving. They were telling the world why. And in doing that, they changed the rules. Royal insiders remember that period as the moment the private became public in a way the institution could never fully forgive. The old model had always been simple: complain if you must, but do it behind closed doors. The family survives by swallowing discomfort, by smiling through insult, by burying personal feeling under ceremony. Harry and Meghan rejected that system. They spoke. First carefully. Then more boldly. Then with the kind of full-force honesty, or what they called honesty, that left palace walls rattling. Interviews followed. Streaming projects followed. Harry's memoir followed. Each new release did two things at once. It gave them a powerful voice in America, and it deepened suspicion inside Britain's oldest institution. Because every confession made them richer in one world and less trusted in the other. That pattern matters. What many people don't know is that royal fallout is rarely caused by one event alone. It is usually a pile. A stack of moments. A slow build of mistrust until one last thing lands on top and the whole thing cracks. The Australia story, if the reports are true, may have been that final piece. Before that, there were already warning signs. There were whispers after the Netflix era that Charles had drawn private lines Harry must never cross again. Royal commentators claimed one of those lines involved using royal identity for obvious commercial gain. Tell your truth if you must, maybe. Speak your pain if you feel you have to. But do not turn the mystique of the monarchy into a business package. Do not sell the glow. Do not bottle the aura. And yet that was always going to be the temptation, wasn't it? Because what exactly was the Sussex brand once the palace gates were behind them? That question followed them everywhere. In America, star power is currency. Story is currency. Reinvention is currency. And Harry and Meghan had all three. She understood image. He carried history on his face. Together they represented something irresistible to networks, publishers, producers, and audiences. Royal, but rebellious. Glamorous, but wounded. Familiar, but still exclusive. A brand like that does not sit quietly. So new deals came. New appearances. New causes. New ventures. Some were taken seriously. Some were mocked. Some looked heartfelt. Some looked polished to the point of calculation. And through it all, the same question kept rising like smoke. Where does personal freedom end and royal exploitation begin? That question became even more sensitive because of Harry's position inside the wider family story. Unlike William, who was always headed toward the center of power, Harry had long been the spare. More flexible. More emotional. More publicly messy. People often forgave him for things they would never forgive his brother. He was seen as the wounded one, the restless one, the one searching for a different path. Then Meghan entered, and the story changed again. Some saw love. Some saw rescue. Some saw ambition. Some saw collision. But almost everyone saw disruption. Together, they became impossible to ignore. Every room grew hotter when they entered it. Every public appearance carried two competing energies at once, modern glamour and old resentment. Even before they left royal life, people around the institution were already wondering how this would end. There was too much tension. Too many competing ideas of duty, privacy, race, control, loyalty, and image. And after the departure, those tensions did not disappear. They became content. That is the word that keeps lurking around this whole saga. Content. It sounds harmless. Almost silly. But in royal terms, it is loaded. Because content is what happens when private life becomes product. When feeling becomes format. When family pain becomes a streamable asset. Accounts from journalists and palace watchers suggest Charles understood that danger from the start. He may not have liked the interviews. He may not have liked the memoir. But the deeper fear was likely this: once the wall between royalty and commercialization fully collapses, it may never be rebuilt. And so, over time, people say the patience began to thin. There were signs. Small, then bigger. Fewer invitations. Less access. Less warmth in public. A tone change in private. Even Harry's visits back to Britain started to feel different. Shorter. More formal. Carefully managed. Every meeting watched. Every headline dissected. There was little sense of a family healing in peace. Instead, there was the feeling of an institution learning how to protect itself from one of its own. That is tragic in a deeply human way. Because for all the glamour and gossip, this is still a son and a father. A son who lost his mother young. A father who spent most of his life preparing to be king. Both carrying grief. Both carrying ego. Both trapped in roles bigger than ordinary people can understand. And then comes Meghan, whose role in public imagination became almost mythic. To her supporters, she was the woman who exposed how cold the institution could be. To her critics, she was the outsider who understood exactly how valuable royal proximity remained, even after the exit. That split never healed either. So when Australia entered the picture, it did not arrive in a calm environment. It arrived in a room full of old fire. And the alleged filming made everything feel familiar in the worst possible way. Once again, the palace was said to be asking whether moments tied to the monarchy were being gathered, shaped, and saved for future release. Once again, the Sussex household was seen by critics as building something just adjacent enough to royalty to profit from it, while insisting it stood outside royal control. That contradiction has haunted every chapter of this saga. Want freedom, but keep status. Reject the system, but keep the shine. Walk away, but still use the light that system gave you. And that is where the warning signs turned into something heavier. Because by the time the stories from Australia began making the rounds, there were already people around the royal world saying Charles would not keep tolerating these blurred lines forever. He had a reign to protect. A slimmed-down monarchy to steady. A future heir to support. He could survive bad press, but not institutional drift. Then came the whispers that changed the mood entirely. Not that the palace was upset. That it was preparing to act. And once that idea began to spread, the question was no longer whether there was tension. It was whether Harry understood just how close he was to losing what little remained. On this particular occasion, it was not a speech, a red carpet, or a headline interview that caused the rupture. It was footage. Or rather, the possibility of footage. That detail is what gave the story its edge. Not something already shown to the world, but something believed to exist. Something private. Something being held. Something that could still be released. And in palace logic, that is often worse. Because once footage exists, control disappears. Every conversation becomes a threat. Every smiling handshake becomes a possible clip. Every carefully staged moment becomes raw material for another public retelling. That is what reportedly sent nerves through Buckingham Palace after Meghan's Australia appearance started drawing attention for all the wrong reasons. At first glance, the trip looked polished enough. Wellness branding. Empowerment language. Controlled glamour. The kind of modern, polished public image Meghan has often leaned into since stepping away from royal duties. To supporters, it may have looked like exactly what she should be doing, building a life on her own terms, far from palace rules. But then the whispers started. Society insiders began hinting that the trip had a second layer. Journalists who tracked the royal beat began circling the same questions. Was it just an appearance, or part of a bigger media project? Were cameras gathering more than standard event footage? Were behind-the-scenes interactions being preserved for something commercial down the line? That was the match near the dry grass. The specific allegation that hit hardest was not simply that Meghan was filming. It was that she was allegedly capturing the kind of atmosphere the palace still considers part of the royal ecosystem. The look. The access. The suggestion of official contact. The unspoken message that, even from California, the Sussexes still carry a value shaped by the monarchy. To palace traditionalists, that is sacred territory. And if reports are to be believed, the concern only deepened when ticket pricing from the broader wellness world around the event became part of the conversation. Numbers floated around. Some said the premium end reached around $3,000. Whether every report was accurate almost became beside the point. The perception itself was enough. The optics were terrible. Royal aura. Luxury price. Possible filming. Global headlines. It sounded like the exact future Buckingham Palace had hoped to avoid. That is why the response, in this retelling, became so immediate. Harry was said to have been blindsided by just how seriously his father viewed the situation. He may have expected palace annoyance. He may even have expected a harsh rebuke. But the mood described by insiders was something colder than anger. It was administrative. Strategic. Like the household had stopped seeing this as an emotional family issue and started treating it as an institutional breach. That shift changes everything. Because once a royal problem becomes constitutional in tone, sentiment loses ground fast. Accounts from royal commentators suggest the warning Harry received was stark. If the Australia material ever appeared as a monetized project, then there would be consequences no one could brush off with a friendly statement or a carefully leaked reconciliation headline. The Sussex titles, people whispered, could be placed into abeyance. Not loudly stripped in a theatrical public fight, but effectively frozen, neutralized, left hanging in a kind of royal deep freeze. That alone would be humiliating. But there was more. Some reports claimed the warning stretched further than titles. A permanent block on access to royal residences. No more soft landings. No more private room kept available through old affection or protocol. No more assumption that Harry could move between exile and belonging whenever family crisis called him home. And then came the harshest layer of all, the financial freeze. This was described not as dramatic punishment, but as total severance of any remaining diplomatic or security ties that still connected Harry, however faintly, to state-managed support in Britain. In plain terms, the message was said to be simple: if you are outside, then you are outside. No blur. No hybrid. No exceptions. Harry, according to the emotional logic of this story, was devastated by one realization above all others. For the first time, his father was not speaking like a wounded parent. He was speaking like the crown itself. That lands differently. It is one thing to disappoint your father. It is another thing to understand that your father has now folded himself completely into an institution that can outweight, outfreeze, and outlast almost anyone. You can argue with a man. You cannot easily argue with a monarchy. And where was Meghan in all this? Standing firm, according to the more dramatic whispers. The Australia project, some claimed, was viewed by her camp not as a mistake, but as a major creative work. A defining statement. A polished answer to years of criticism and misrepresentation. In that version of events, backing down would not have felt strategic. It would have felt like surrender. That put Harry in an impossible position. Loyalty to his wife on one side. The wreckage of his birth family on the other. His American future against his royal past. A man can survive public criticism. Plenty do. But being pulled between two identities, two homes, and two versions of himself? That kind of conflict tears more quietly and more deeply. People close to royal reporting often say Harry has spent years trying to turn pain into purpose. Sometimes he has done that effectively. Sometimes he has turned it into performance. The line between the two has not always been clear. But this alleged phone call, this reported warning, seems to sit in a different category. It was not about narrative anymore. It was about loss. The loss of what remained. And the tragedy is that by the time a story reaches this point, solutions usually shrink. Once formal warnings enter the room, forgiveness starts packing its bags. Once titles are mentioned, the emotional mess becomes public architecture. Once homes, money, and access are on the table, the family fight is no longer a private wound. It becomes policy. That is the moment Harry is said to have entered after Australia. Not a tabloid storm. Not another bad week. A genuine endgame. And still, the full truth was not out in the open. Not yet. The footage had not been released. The project had not been publicly confirmed in all the ways the rumors suggested. Much of the drama remained trapped in whispers, palace caution, and the deep uncertainty of what would happen next. Would Meghan pull back? Would Harry persuade her? Would Charles soften? Or had all of them already moved too far into pride to step backward now? One thing, however, seemed clear in the way this story was being told by those watching closely. The palace no longer believed it was dealing with misunderstanding. It believed it was dealing with intent. And that is when royal conflicts become dangerous. The full picture, as it emerged through gossip, commentary, and insider-style reporting, was not neat. Stories like this never are. They come in pieces. A whisper here. A denial there. A sudden headline. A carefully silent palace. A source. Close to the matter. A friend of a friend who knows how upset everyone is. It is messy, emotional, half-lit. But even messy stories reveal patterns. And the pattern many people began seeing here was brutal. The Sussexes, in the eyes of their critics, were still trying to live in two worlds at once. Free from the monarchy, yet still shaped by it. Independent, yet commercially strengthened by the very institution they had condemned. Not working royals, but still wrapped in the royal glow that makes every appearance, every title, every handshake carry more weight than it otherwise would. That is what made the Australia Whispers so explosive. It was not only about filming. It was about meaning. If private access, official atmosphere, or royal-adjacent prestige were really being gathered into a glossy project, then the palace sphere suddenly made perfect sense. The concern was not just embarrassment. It was erosion. The slow draining away of the monarchy's value into private hands, one polished project at a time. Accounts from witnesses, journalists, and society insiders often reveal the same truth about royal life. Symbols matter more than ordinary people think. A title is not just a word. A residence is not just a building. A meeting is not just a meeting. Everything means something. Everything sits inside a much older structure of power, class, and public image. So when Charles reportedly threatened to place the Sussex titles into abeyance, the message was bigger than punishment. It was symbolic quarantine. A way of saying, if you insist on using the glow while rejecting the rules, then the glow itself may be withdrawn. That would be historic in emotional terms, even if handled quietly in formal terms. Public reaction, as always with this family, would likely split right down the middle. Some would say good. Enough is enough. They left, they talked, they sold, they complained, and now they want to keep cashing in on what they walked away from. Those critics would see Charles's move as long overdue, maybe even weak for taking this long. Others would say the opposite. They would argue that Harry and Meghan have every right to build a life, tell their story, and use their fame the way any public figures do. They would call palace outrage selective and hypocritical. After all, the monarchy itself survives on image, spectacle, symbolism, and public hunger. Why condemn others for understanding the same game? That tension is why these stories never die. They are never only about one couple. They are about class, about family, about race, about celebrity, about power dressed as duty, about pain sold as truth, about truth polished into business. And somewhere in the middle of all that, there is Harry. Always Harry. Still the boy people remember walking behind his mother's coffin. Still the prince who looked easier to read than the rest. Still the man who told the world he wanted freedom, then discovered that freedom without roots can feel like another kind of trap. That may be the saddest part of this whole chapter. Because if the rumors are even partly right, then Harry is not just fighting with his father or defending his wife. He is watching the last fragile bridge to his old life crack beneath him. And unlike before, there may be no public relations move strong enough to rebuild it. No interview fixes this. No memoir fixes this. No carefully staged family reunion photo fixes this. Because the issue here, in the palace mind, is no longer hurt feelings. It is institutional trust. And once that is gone, even love starts speaking through lawyers, officials, and protocols. As for Meghan, the story presents her in the role she so often occupies in royal gossip, unbending, ambitious, impossible to scare. To admirers, that reads as strength. To critics, calculation. But whichever side people choose, one thing is clear in this telling. She is not being cast as someone ready to retreat quietly just because the palace disapproves. If anything, the whispers make her sound more certain than ever that her version of the story deserves to be seen. That confidence may be exactly what terrifies Buckingham Palace. Because the monarchy can survive scandal. It can even survive internal betrayal. What it struggles with is loss of control. And nothing threatens control like a camera pointed the wrong way. So what happens now? That is the question hanging over everything. If the project never appears, the threat may remain a warning shot, frightening but unfinished. If it does appear, and if it carries even a trace of what palace insiders seem to fear, then the consequences could be severe, public, and deeply personal. Not just another ugly news cycle. Something colder. Something official. Something final. That is why this story feels bigger than one tour, one phone call, or one rumored piece of footage. It feels like the climax of years of mistrust finally hardening into a choice nobody can avoid anymore. The son or the system. The marriage or the monarchy. The last of the family bond or the last of the royal privilege. And maybe that is why the image of Harry after the call feels so powerful, even in rumor form. Not because we know exactly what was said. We don't. Not because every whisper is true. It may not be. But because the emotional shape of it rings painfully familiar. A prince who spent years running from the palace suddenly realizes the palace may be done running after him. That changes a man. In the end, these stories provide insight into something far older than tabloid drama. They show what happens when love, loyalty, image, money, and history all pull in different directions. They show how power protects itself. They show how families break in slow motion long before the public sees the cracks. And they show that in royal life, the most devastating words are rarely shouted. They are spoken calmly, formally, almost softly, like a door closing.